All right, now let's look at an actual, I guess, reference type variable that we're going to be using. And we've actually been using it in some of our previous examples of code. And those are strings. So a string is something, is a variable type that allows us to store basically a string of characters. Typically, when we think of strings, we want to think about words, but a word is really a string of characters. And one thing to note when we use strings, if you remember in a character, we use the single quote. When you use a string variable, a variable of a type string, you must put whatever your text in double quotes. And those are, again, one of the rules for Java for using the string variable. And so what happens when we use a string variable, it's a reference type variable. So whenever we create the string variable, Java is going to create a space in memory. And so the Java is doing some work here, but in that it creates space in memory and it figures out how to store the value that we provide. So if we create a string called hey and what's poppin', Java creates the space in memory and then figures out how to store what's poppin'. And then what it does is actually our variable hey is going to be given the address that points to what's poppin' in memory. Us as developers, we don't have to think about what Java's doing to convert the memory address to what's poppin'. All we have to think about is that the variable hey contains what's poppin'. But just behind the scenes, we know what's happening, and understanding what's happening behind the scenes is helpful. And we're going to see an example in actual code soon. All right, so now we're going to see an example of a reference type variable, how they work in practice, as well as seeing how strings work, because strings are reference type variables. So we're going to create a class called reference variable. And we're going to get rid of all the stuff that they give us by default. And we're going to create our public or our main method, where we're going to write all of our code so that we can execute it. And so now let's create some strings. So this is how you create a string. Let's call this first. Let's call it space 1. We'll create another string. Let's call it sec, short for second. And then we're going to print this out, these two variables, so that we can see what's in them. I'm going to copy this to make it faster. Okay, and so now let's make first equal sec. And so what's going to happen here, from our understanding of how reference type variables work, is first is now going to hold the address that's in that's in sec. And if that's true, if we print out first, it should print out space 2. And also, if you remember, so Java is in charge of figuring out how to translate the address into the value that we care about. We're using strings here, so we only really care about what the text that we store in the string. And Java is figuring out how to translate that address and then get us the value that we want in the back end. And then another thing that we could do is we can do sec, and let's make it equal to something else. And what we're doing here in Java, whenever we use a string and we set it equal to something different than what we originally set it equal to, it actually is creating new space in memory. And then it's also then assigning a new address that maps to that new space in memory. And then that new memory address is what we get in the variable. So if we print out sec, we're going to get something else. Why is it showing up? So, and if we were to print out first again, it's going to be pointing to what sec used to be pointing to. So it's going to print out space 2 again. And let's see this run so we can see it in action. And I'm going to pull up, where's the code? So we can compare. Okay, so we first created our 2 variables and we printed out first. So that's, we see space 1 and we see sec, which is space 2. We set first equal to sec. So now first should be pointing to the same address that sec is pointing to. And essentially, so they're the same value. And so when we printed out first, we got space 2 again. We then set sec equal to something else, and we printed that out, and we got something else. But first was pointing to what sec, before we changed sec, first was pointing to sec, which was space 2. And if we print out first, you can see we're still pointing to that space 2. So sec is pointing to something different, and first, that pointer is still there. And it's space 2. And so now you can see how reference type variables work, as well as how strings, this is a kind of intro to how strings work.